Wonderful. Thank you all for coming. This is Usability in Wonderland. I'm Nicole Lazzaro, and I'm looking forward to spending the next 30 minutes talking to you about really interesting ideas that we have about VR. So, virtual reality, in a sense, games have always created it. It's this magic circle we draw our players in for a few minutes, a few hours, a few days. And games have been doing this for decades, and so have I. I'm Nicole Lazzaro. I'm a VR game developer, and I've been running XEODesign for the past 20 years, worked on some titles you've heard of. And I am a filmmaker. I study emotion. I measure emotion on people's faces, designed the first iPhone game, as well as the 4 Keys to Fun, which we'll be talking about just a little tiny bit here. But more importantly is that the reason why I'm so passionate about VR, it's sort of this way. If I think about working on games like The Matrix, VR is really this trip down the rabbit hole to experience Wonderland. And I actually grew up in Wonderland. I spent 5 years overseas riding camels, climbing pyramids, exploring fire temples. And I want to go back, I really want to go back to that time when I was a kid and experience that full-bodied wonder I had as a child, and bring all my friends. And I imagine some of you in the audience kind of want to do that too. What would it be like to be a kid again? But the challenge that we all face, everyone in this room faces, is that basically without compelling experiences, as amazing as the technology is, it can't guarantee the fun. And in fact, the train isn't even going to leave the station unless we in this room create experiences people want to play again and again and again. And that's where that magic comes in, and that's where that sense of wonder comes in with VR. So we've been spending the past few years studying a lot of people playing games in VR, and here are we're going to share with you some of the results of that research. Mostly, if you think about it, the biggest problem we're solving is that for a lot of experiences, people will only want to play for 15 minutes. These techniques we're talking about today are going to help you get out beyond that. What we face in VR, it's a new platform, we face what we call the innovator's dilemma. So this is Clayton Christensen's book, really wonderful thing. But if you imagine, technology always goes through this cycle. We start with the automobile, we start with the horse and buggy, we go to the horseless carriage, and then we get to the automobile. There's always this awkward teenage phase in any kind of technology that humans have ever developed. And that's definitely where we are in right now. VR is covered with acne, not so sure of itself, and really not, maybe we wipe the headsets off a little bit more, so it's not so much acne, but we are moving through this phase to get what we call, true VR. And if you just attach an old gen console, to a controller to a VR experience, it's about as satisfying as a transparent D-pad on an iPhone game, right? It's very much a horseless carriage. It's neither one nor the other. So we're going to talk about some things. To get there, what we need to do, though, is we need to have really good tools and language. We all need a roadmap. We need to create this together. And these tools, this language, these techniques are super, super important. These phrases here I have on the screen do not help. Okay, what do we mean by presence, right? How can I measure that in my lab? What is that? What are we going to do? Empathy. All right, what does that mean? How are we going to get everything is different? That's not a design strategy. So what we want to know is what are the first principles for VR? How do we think like a VR designer so that then we can make this feel like Wonderland? Because that, my friends, is what VR is all about. It's that magical feeling of getting in there. So we're going to do today is we're going to run through 5 things you should never do in VR. Okay, take a look. And we're going to show you a little bit about how to do them. Okay, so you guys ready? Okay, let's go. Well, first we got to do one thing is we have to know what VR is. And VR is hot. The first thing is VR is hot. On the Marshall-McLuhan scale, it's way off the charts. If you think about a book, it's cognitive, it's in the forebrain. If you think about a movie, it's back in the visual cortex. If you think about games, it's in that motor cortex, right? And then with VR, it's really in the basal brain. It's in that center brain. That's where the experience is. That's how deep we go in VR. That's very different than anything. So the emotions in VR, deeper, stronger, more personal than anything we've ever worked in. The second thing we need to know about VR is that everybody in this room, whether you come from film or whether you come from games, We've always had 3 crayons in our box as designers. We've had a red, a green, and a blue crayon. And we've made some amazing, yeah, don't get me wrong, we've made some amazing experiences with those 3 crayons. But we, with VR, are actually given a 4th crayon, okay? So we've got these 3, we now have a 4th crayon. And that 4th crayon is depth, okay? And it is how, by and large, in our research, it is how an experience uses the depth crayon, the depth component, is what makes a VR experience not only usable, but fun, accessible, and really, going after that wonderland. Now, if we look at depth, I have a degree in psychology, and there's some really interesting stuff happens. There's a London taxi driver experiment that was done. So these were taxi drivers that had just gotten their license, and then they drove around the streets of London, and they measured the size, the mass of their hippocampus, which is deep in your brain, before they started and then after they started. They were there for a while. And what they noticed is the density of that actually increased. Now, why this is important for VR, it's that spatial knowledge is partially stored in a different area than what we've been using before. I'll try this little experiment, okay? I like experiments. How many of you, these are 2 scenes from our current game right now. We're doing at XEODesign. XEOPlay is Follow the White Rabbit. So see if you can spot a few differences, in the top and in the bottom, okay? How many people can see 1 difference? Okay, 2, 3, 4, 8, okay? Now, I'm going to make it a little bit easier, okay? So now I'm going to take, or actually I'm going to make it, yeah, so we can see, you spot the difference here, right? All right, so this is the screen. And now, that's that second screen. How many differences do you see now between these 2? Did anything change? How many people see as many as they saw before? It's a little bit harder, isn't it, right? And it's easier if I just put it like this, right? Now how many do you see? Those were all the things that were changing between those 2 screens. A lot easier to see, right? Basically, the white frame was flashing your visual memory on your cortex, so you couldn't retain the sensation of the previous frame. Now, if we run the same experiment and add depth information, something pretty cool happens. Is that you're actually, if you had to tap the things or place the items in a real 3D scene, you're actually, even with a white flash, even with seeing a different photograph, you're actually able to say what moved and what changed. Which means, my friends, that means that the depth information in your scene, in your game right now, is stored in a different part of the brain. And you've never designed there before. And I argue further that if you can't play your game with just the depth map on, no red, no green, no blue, just depth, then you really do not have a VR experience. The last thing I wanted to say about VR is that we want to use spatial learning. Now, this is pretty cool. This is an AR experience. You can see the human heart. It's kind of fun. It's using VR. It's kind of cool. But when we really want to use VR, this is where we're going. Because scale, time, space, POV, those are really powerful tools in the VR toolbox. And when you are inside that heart, you have experienced that heart, you take that away. So we want to use spatial learning. You can look that up. Go ahead and Google that, spatial learning. Really fun stuff there. Inside, that's where VR really goes. Now, I'm not saying that everyone should put their game inside a human heart. That's not what I meant. But I think you guys go. So let's run through some things to help us do some things that are pretty hard to do in VR. So the first one is, move the camera. The first thing you want to do is not do, especially the first game out, a follow cam. Use a God cam instead. If you do a diagonal jumping puzzle, God help you, it's going to be fun because you not only you do not feel up and down motion or side to side motion, you not feel the depth motion either. So you're basically blanking out all 3 sensors in your inner ear. It'll make you really nauseous. And then add a follow cam for some extra movement. Yeah, that's fun. That's a great way to redecorate your office. Okay, as many of you know, external framing really works well. So this is Gunjack, Eve, whatever. You've got basically you've got a cockpit, and that really helps with motion. Now the challenge though is that the actual game is happening beyond our ability to perceive depth. So from 1 to 10 meters, that's where we have really good depth perception as human beings. But the game might as well be on a billboard because the only thing I'm seeing is that little laser that flies out. Okay. So that external framing. So what we can do though if we don't have a cockpit, like our game isn't about a space marine. Well, you can do something different. We call this architecture framing at my studio. And this is Spielberg's very famous for oneers, which is these long takes. And he uses architecture, three-dimensional architecture in the scene to allow you to stay with the scene longer, to understand it. We're going to use it in VR a little differently than he intended, but it's a really good example. Take a look at what happens here. There's no audio, it's just the visuals. But so now we're on this ferry in the movie Jaws. Now take a look at what's happening. So where am I grounded? Where do I know? How do I know? How am I interpreting as the viewer what's happening? How is the action happening? How is that framing from the inside the action? So you see how this is an internal framing. The architecture itself is framing the scene. And this is why Hover Junkers works. Okay, it's on a platform, and you can move a lot faster in this than you can without the hovercraft. It's also why, follow the white rabbit, why we have those white columns and a lot of very strong architectural elements in the scene, is so that we know orientation, and we also have a strong sense of framing visually. So our visual is feeding us a lot of information, the depth information. We're really getting a strong sense of that space. That helps a lot with motion. So moving the camera, so this is a motion, basically it's a gaze game where you just rotate around in one spot. It's also offset slightly, not in the very center, because if it's in the very center, you will feel like you're on a record and get a little dizzy. Those kinds of things are good to pay attention to. So teleporting should be pretty obvious. There's been a lot of talks on that. The use of the white flash, a lot of talks on that. However, remember, it's visual memory only. So we white flash, you're going to blank out, remember our experiment, right? You blank out what you just saw. You did not touch the stored memory of the depth of that room or that location. Okay, if you need to flash that, you're going to have to flash it with something else, some other way. Okay, and there's some great psychologies for some ideas, or you can talk to me later. Slow motion, bullet time is another great way to move the camera. We've seen a lot of those examples. Eagle Flight now is using a technique where anything that's moving too fast, it's basically dampening down the speed of the animation around the periphery. So when you go faster, basically your point of view, your FOV goes tighter, and you get more black around the screen. So that allows you to move faster without creating as much sensation of motion. That's a really nice technique. Another one, this is on a linear thing, so a 6:9. It's about solitary confinement. It's a linear movie, but I love what they did because they had to compress time. You don't want to force people to spend 8 hours or a decade in solitary confinement to experience the piece. That would be boring. So what they did is they, every time they wanted to make a cut, they basically started to shake the whole world, right, and flash the fluorescent lights a little bit, shake, and then then the books moved into a new spot, and then now you knew you were in a new time. And so they did an earthquake, or shaking the camera. Is a nice technique, and then covering. So we've had a lot of experiences I've seen where they throw a burlap sack over you or a blanket over you to move you to the next spot. And now, do you notice if you get covered by something, what's happening to your spatial awareness, your spatial understanding, right? You're actually getting covered by a three-dimensional object. You are inside a volume now. So this is one technique you can use to flush your three-dimensional spatial memory. This is really interesting. I would love for people to do some more exploration on this. The device, this is not the best from lifelike screenshot, but they have a controller that you use to do the joystick navigation, which is what will really make you not comfortable. But because of some of the affordances on that, it actually makes it not so bad. If the device you're using is represented in the screen, it can actually be an internal framing. It's not the architecture, but if the device itself, and then they have a lot of really big feedback on whether you're going forward or backward, or whether you're applying pressure forward, backward, left, and right, it becomes almost like you're steering this car, and the car is steering in the where your hand is. It's a rather interesting. I'd love to see some more work done on that. So let's move on though, because we've got a lot to cover. We've got 4 more to cover. So using a HUD, very difficult to do, not something you should do lightly in VR, because the whole point of virtual reality is to remove the abstraction layer, right? You want that to be as thin as possible. A HUD basically says, oh, there's a glass wall between you and the experience, and that's exact opposite of what you want to try to do to feel like it's a virtual experience. So when you think about HUD, think about depth. This is of course, tilt brush. And it's that world. So that appeal is actually, a lot of it is in the use of space, and of course their UIs are 3D on the devices that you're holding. The world is your UI. I think that's an even better approach. This is a job simulator, an awesome, fun kind of game. And it's the interacting, your interface is really just the two hands. The world is your UI. Fantastic contraption also, same kind of idea. You're building a world. And what happens here that is really cool, more so than Job Simulator, they're both cool, but is that you get that sense of progress. Minecraft's fun because at the end you get like a player piano made out of blocks, or you get the Eiffel Tower made out of little blocks. You get you get progress, visual progress. The little progress bar we have is an abstraction in games. Super popular, but in a virtual world, progress towards a goal probably should have a physical instantiation in the world. So think about this. What could be in your game? What could really instantiate progress? Because that will feel very visceral, very real, and does a lot of what we call serious fun, which is great. If you do have to have a UI in the world, this is a fairly old screenshot, but you want to, this is from Defense Grid 2, the VR experience, you want to put it, come out of the objects in the UI, and then be sure that you have a really clear color language, because your UI is going to be popping up in different locations. And you want to make sure that you can use color is one technique to connect the activities that are happening on all these different separate UIs. And shape languages are also important. One of the challenges, though, is that you might have some kind of global thing that needs to be universal. We often put them on the floor, or we put them up above. But you want to be sure in gameplay that you're designing your gaze in the game, like what does the player do over and over again, look-wise. Side-to-side movement is uncomfortable, but it's also a lot physically easier than up and down. Because most of these head-mounted displays are really heavy, right? And so, if you do up and down, you're doing chin-ups, right? But this kind of chin-up, right? You're doing nose-up, I don't know. But that's heavy, and that hurts in your neck after a while. So we want to be careful about that vertical motion. Don't put that in your core loop if you can all avoid it. AR HUDs are awesome. I think this was some of the feedback I gave CCP in that, if you're going to have a HUD, at least make it AR, right? And then if you make it AR, don't make it on a glass, right? Make it with multiple dimensions so that you can go in and out and you feel that HUD would be in that. There's a world of that HUD, so that each plane is at a different depth. That feels pretty compelling. Carrying that one further, these are some screens from Follow the White Rabbit, is that we want the cursor to be 3D as well. So the cursor feedback, which is this magic, smoky, glowy thing, once we put that in 3D, as opposed to like a 2D decal pasted on that newspaper that you pick up, the 3D, oh wow, that really sold the depth. It's kind of like James Cameron when Avatar had CETA, crap in the air or something like that, it was said. That it basically wanted little floaty things in the mid-range to make it feel like depth. Well, your cursor can really take advantage of that. Also, gesture toggles. I really love this on Bridge Crew, where it isn't just pushing a button, because that's not fun. It's moving the gesture, right? Being able to move and slide and move things around. That's what's really compelling about thing. Another design language that's emerging, I think something special, like the floating dice in Kismet is really powerful. That tells you it's your turn. So the dice have landed here, but they float and they sparkle and they levitate. So could only happen in VR. Tells you your turn. It's a nice thing to get started. Now again, we're still looking at a board game in 3D, so we got to do better than that. That's not real VR, but these are all baby steps, right? Weapons, HUDs on the weapon should be pretty obvious. And device, if you have to, as a last resort, okay, you've got a device and it has a HUD on it, your Pet Boys or whatever. So a couple more, we've got cloning gameplay. So things you should never do in VR, and actually this is probably true, we really shouldn't clone gameplay, but if we have to, these are some things to think about. Is that the first thing you want to think, if you're going to put your last hit game onto the new VR, whether it's a first-person shooter or a sports game, you have to answer this question first. Okay, where is the fun? Okay, where is the fun? Because if it's not fun, people aren't going to actually buy it, right? Or they're not going to play it. They'll put it on once, 15 minutes, sock drawer, that's it. We're not going to get there. And then make sure that fun is deep, right? Make sure that it has depth. Make sure that the fun of the game is using, it's not just turning the pages are cool in 3D, it's the actual gameplay that's 3D. There's more research on this. How many people are familiar with the 4 keys to fun? Yeah, a few, okay, great. You can see more of this online. You can download it for free. But the idea is that each emotion in gameplay, these are 4 ways in which the gameplay creates emotions, and emotions, a game without emotions is no fun, is not fun. And they each have a different function I've highlighted 4 here. We're going to move on, though, because VR is really only delivering what we call easy fun, which is that curiosity, wonder, and surprise. It's why our sessions are only 15 minutes, and it's not really getting into the challenge yet, the VR kind of challenge. And in a sense, it's that micro loop of gameplay. If you think of gameplay, we work with our clients about this. It's like that easy fun is just that micro loop of gameplay. We want to expand VR experiences from that, because that's, again, why people will only play, comfort issues aside, for only 15 minutes, because there's no more there. It's like, well, what else do I do? So we want to, if you will, escape, reach critical velocity with our game design and escape the micro loop of gameplay. Whether we create more hard fun of challenge and a goal, or social people fun, something that gets us out of that small, tight micro loop. So let's get some examples. Gestures and spoken. Oh my gosh, it's so amazing. It's like I got all this really amazing animation, and like I can cast spells and I can move things around. It's like awesome. And then the gameplay is, well, I can launch fireballs at someone else, and that's it. Right? It's like, well, I could just do that with a first-person shooter and just with my mouse, right? Bing, 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 bing. I mean, it's challenging to get to cast the spell. But then I want to put that in the context of a game that, I'm running around Hogwarts, or, I've got some magical, things that have to be summoned out of the ground, or, we're moving, something that's really epic, not just, this is just a first-person shooter with a gaze trigger, or a gesture trigger, anyway. So if you think about weapons, 3D weapons, super satisfying is a bow, because what am I doing here in real life? I've got, that matters, all this matters, this is really fun. And then a sword, a light sword, those are really fun. We've done a lot of work on the Star Wars games, and those can be compelling. And puzzles, you want to make sure that those puzzles have that 3D kind of component to them, not just painted on like, oh, now it's 3D and it's crosswords. We really want to have something that's really compelling for people to actually play. So inspiration, I hope you take away from this. You can be inspired by your target, clone target, but don't actually clone. So with White Rabbit, what we're doing is we are expanding that some of the obvious game mechanics with new things that could only happen in VR, and then creating this hybrid, trying to be as much an auto and not a horseless carriage as we can in this generation. So last 2 are creating strong emotion. Now everybody knows that VR, or should know, VR can create some really strong emotions. And that's great, but we want to do this carefully, because there's a lot of weeds. The reward is this: VR can actually solve, emotion can actually solve some of VR's most challenging problems, many of them. And this is what we, what we do. And you can create all kinds of really cool things with emotion. But VR's most dangerous emotion, what do you think VR's most dangerous emotion is? It's the one that makes you rip the headset off. Huh? Fear? Frustration? Yeah, because basically motion, the stuff we have, is disgust. So you can measure it here. It's all the wrinkles on the face. Oh, yuck. And sad news here, the other thing that also triggers disgust is this other beast in our world, Uncanny Valley. And more sad news, I'm sorry to provide you, so does blood, dead bodies, and zombies. So I'm very sorry to bring that bad news, but so if you can see, all of these things are basically conflating in order to rip that headset off the face, keep us on under that 15-minute time frame. We've got to do something about that. Well, small, short talk, more online, you can come after later, but I think that emotion polarity is a pretty powerful concept. It's a great intro, in that emotions actually have a polarity. They come into the body or they push it away. Disgust is throwing up, it's pushing out, right? Anger is another outward thing. It's outward, so it's pulling that mask off, right? But something sweet, hunger, that sort of thing coming into the body. A lot of joy, a lot of laughter, a lot of that is coming into the body. And that curiosity and wonder are all inward-facing polarity, emotion polarity. So that's going to have the emotion, that's going to pull you in. Each time you get a little ting of curiosity, that pulls you into that narrative, that pulls you into that scene, that keeps that headset on. And it's, you want to make sure that that's used in depth. The other thing is about emotion is intensity, right? So Hitchcock, he was the master of fear, jump scares, or this one. Suspense, right? Yeah, master of suspense. Suspense is the moment before fear, before the thing that involves the shower curtain and the knife and whatever. But it keeps you in Aliens, the great movie. It's like you don't see the alien until reel 3, I think. Okay, it's all of this. Oh my, oh, it was the cat. Or like, wow, you put the ballpoint pen in the blood and it dissolves. Like this blood is acid. All of this crazy stuff, right? It's all happening. But you're not at all, it's not just like, put it simply, jump scares are the fart apps of VR. Let's not do that. So emotion profile and architectures, you want to choose your emotion profile. So you can choose the emotions that are going to go with your brand, your gameplay, whatever. That's your profile. And then you create an architecture as an interaction, as a VR designer. What is the architecture by which you're going to provide the opportunity to experience those emotions? And then thread that through your gameplay, through your worlds. That's how you do something different. That's how you innovate. So lastly, we're going to play some audio, or we're going to look at playing audio. So wait a minute, you can't play audio in games? I mean, that's kind of crazy. And it's really interesting. We've been working a little bit with the SubPac folks and doing experiments. And audio is processed very differently in the body than the eyes. It's often thought that we just like stereoscopic, visual. Stereoscopic audio is like, well, we just put up 2 microphones, right? And we measure that, we record, and then we play back, and then the brain somehow figures out, well, the difference between my 2 ears will actually create the sense of space and all of that. But what this is true of the tradition of stereoscopic audio design since the beginning. And notice where it's sort of a polarity thing as well. Notice the direction of those arrows. So even when you are in a space, a lot of these things really still feel like they're happening inside your head, right? Even though you're supposed to be on the band with Ringo on one side and George on the other, and you're playing with the Beatles or whatever, or you're just listening, it's still kind of happening in your head, which is great for a movie, great for a game, but not for VR. Because VR, if you remember polarity, we don't want to pull. We want to pull people into that scene, right? We don't want to pull them away. We don't want them to hit the home button, which is take the thing off. So instead, we want to push out, right? We want to design out all of the audio to feel outside the body in the room, and that's very challenging to do for a number of reasons. But the idea is that if you've got, if you're just taking it's like almost like designing a sound bath. As you move through, and sound is processed on your skin as well as in your ears. As I talk, you actually feel some of my voice on your chest. When the T-Rex comes in afterwards to clear the room, in the VR demo, we would actually feel that low frequency in our feet. And when our feet are numb and we see the T-Rex, it doesn't make sense, right? And it's not as compelling, okay? So we really need to pull people in with the way we design our sound, and we want to spatialize it in a way. And it basically, we put in reverb to make it sound better, but reverb actually contains information. So we want to make sure that information you're using that to pull people into that world, to pull it into those things, and make sure it communicates depth. Lots of different ways to communicate depth through audio. Make sure that you're doing it. All right, so a wonderful game, Notes on Blindness. If you haven't played that or it's an experience, it's mostly audio and very, very nice. It's a researcher who basically took audio recordings of himself as he gradually became blind. And then they've taken selection of these and animated them in VR with a very minimal, very low sight kind of simulation, which is kind of fun. It's a rather really nice thing by Archer's Mark. So to wrap up, we've got 36 benchmarks. There's lots of other stuff that we're doing, that we're researching. There's lots of fun ways to kind of come at these experiences, and really want to look at when you are in your games. Look at how do you move the camera. How are you using that HUD? Using something in AR or in the world. How are you porting that gameplay, like being inspired rather than just porting, and creating those strong emotions, but intelligently. It's really more television than theater in terms of the volume of them. and then how do you play audio. So just be cautious. But I think we can do a lot of really good if we attack these problems together to create some of these experiences that really, really feel like Wonderland. You can do an analysis of how are we using that depth crayon in your design and say well, what are we doing on these things? And so that's it. I'd love you to remember to fill out your surveys for all the talks you saw, all the great talks you saw today, because that's how we all get invited back, or not. And if you had a good time. And then if you want to drop up your business card, we were going to put out, I wasn't quite ready for today, but we're doing a VR design canvas. So if you'd like to get a copy of that, feel free to drop me a card or a note. Okay, so I don't know if we have any time for questions, but thank you very much. Do we have time for one question? Anyone want? All right. Thank you.